The year was 1855, and the air along the Mississippi Delta carried the weight of more than just humidity. It carried secrets, secrets buried deep in the soil, whispered between cypress trees, and sealed in the dark hearts of men who had learned to live with guilt as naturally as they did with breath. The Dalton plantation stretched for miles along the river, its white columns standing proud against the slow burn of sunset, yet the house seemed less a home and more a ghostly reminder of what once was. Inside it lived a woman who no longer knew the difference between mourning and madness. Her name was Evelyn Dalton. For months Evelyn had lived in the silence left by her husband's arrest. Samuel Dalton, once the most respected cotton baron in 3 counties, was now confined in the county jail 2 towns over, accused of murdering a Union inspector who had come down from Washington to investigate reports of illegal slave trading. The rumor spread faster than wildfire that Samuel had lured the man to the river under the pretense of business and shot him dead before throwing the body into the current. Evelyn had not believed it, not at first. Her husband was a hard man, yes, but he was not a killer. At least, that was what she had told herself when she first heard the news. The town of Vicksburg whispered that she knew more than she admitted, that the widow, in waiting with her pale face and trembling hands, was hiding something darker than grief. The nights were the worst. When the cicadas grew quiet and the fog rolled over the fields, Evelyn would sit by the window in her nightdress and stare at the gallows being built across the courthouse yard, its shape faint in the distance but unmistakable. She had not been able to look at it for long. Each time she tried, her throat tightened until she felt she might choke on the air itself. It was on one such night that she received the letter. The knock came just after midnight, 2 sharp raps on the heavy oak door, startling her from her seat. When she opened it, there was no one there, only the damp air and a sealed envelope lying at her feet. The wax was stamped with the sheriff's insignia. Inside, the words were brief: "The execution of Samuel Dalton is set for the 17th. The hangman will arrive 3 days prior." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she read the line again and again. The words blurred in her vision until they no longer made sense. She sank to the floor, clutching the paper to her chest, her tears soaking through the ink. The next morning brought no comfort. The household staff, once full and bustling, had dwindled to 2, an elderly cook named Marla and a stable boy too young to shave. Most of the field hands had been sold off to cover legal debts. The plantation was collapsing around her, its fences falling, its fields overgrown. Evelyn moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by the echo of her husband's boots on the staircase, the faint scent of his tobacco, the warmth of his voice in the evenings when he spoke of the future they would build. Now there was only the ticking of the clock and the steady beat of her heart, reminding her that time was moving forward whether she wanted it to or not. On the morning the hangman arrived, the sun broke through a thick curtain of grey. Evelyn was standing at the veranda, the hem of her dress brushing against the dust of the steps, when she saw the rider coming down the road. He was tall and lean, with the posture of a soldier and the quiet confidence of a man who had seen death too often to fear it any more. The horse beneath him was black as night, and when he dismounted, she noticed the faint limp in his step, as though an old injury still haunted him. He removed his hat, and his eyes, cold, piercing blue, met hers for the briefest moment. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, his voice low but steady, "I'm Thomas Hale. I was sent from Jackson." She nodded, her throat too dry for words. She had expected someone older, someone cruel perhaps, but this man was neither. There was a heaviness in his gaze, a kind of weary dignity that unsettled her more than anger ever could. He looked at her with respect, not pity, and that made her heart ache in a way she could not explain. "I'll need a room," he said after a pause. "I was told I'd be staying on the grounds until the deed is done. Marla will see to it," Evelyn replied quietly. "The guest quarters by the east wing are still fit." He nodded again, gave a polite tip of his hat, and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Evelyn watched him disappear around the corner, her pulse unsteady. Something about his presence made her feel both frightened and alive for the first time in months. That night she could not sleep. She paced her room, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards in the east wing where Thomas Hale had taken residence. She imagined him there sitting at a desk, polishing his instruments, perhaps writing a report. The thought made her skin crawl. This was the man sent to kill her husband, yet when she had looked into his eyes that morning, she had seen no cruelty, no hunger for death, only sorrow. The following day, Thomas began inspecting the grounds near the courthouse where the gallows would be raised. Evelyn rode into town under the pretense of delivering a petition for mercy, though in truth she only wished to see him again. She found him standing by the wooden beams, speaking with the sheriff. His back was to her, the sun casting his shadow long across the dirt. When he turned and saw her, his expression softened just enough to betray surprise. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, stepping toward her, "you shouldn't be here, neither should you," she answered before she could stop herself. Her voice quivered with more emotion than she intended. He studied her for a long moment, then lowered his tone. "It isn't my place to question the sentence. I only carry it out. And yet you look as though it weighs on you." He hesitated. "It does." That night, as the rain began to fall, Evelyn found herself at her writing desk, pen in hand, unable to compose the letter she had promised to the governor. Her candle burned low, casting the room in golden shadows. Outside, she could hear footsteps approaching. When she opened the door, Thomas Hale stood there, soaked from the rain, his hat in his hand. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said quietly. "Marla told me the stable roof has collapsed. I came to ask if you'd allow me to stay in the main house until morning." Her pulse quickened. "Of course," she whispered. "You can take the study." As he entered, water dripped from his coat onto the polished floorboards. The air between them thickened with something unspoken. Evelyn felt her chest tighten as he removed his gloves, his fingers scarred and calloused from years of hard service. "Mrs. Dalton," he began, his tone hesitant. "You should know I didn't volunteer for this assignment. They sent me because I'm good at what I do, but good doesn't always mean willing." She swallowed hard, her eyes locked on his. "Then why do it?" "Because refusing would mean another man would come, and he wouldn't care." For a moment neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence. Evelyn could feel her resolve breaking, piece by piece. She had lived for months wrapped in fear, anger, and loneliness, but now, standing before this man, a man burdened by his own demons, she felt something awaken inside her, something she thought had died with her husband's arrest. That night, long after he retired to the study, Evelyn remained awake, listening to the wind against the shutters, the echo of his footsteps below. She wondered what kind of man carried death in his hands and still spoke with mercy. When she finally closed her eyes, his face haunted her dreams, not as her husband's executioner, but as something else entirely, something forbidden. Morning came with the scent of wet earth and magnolia blossoms. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, but inside the Dalton house a different storm was gathering. Thomas Hale stood at the parlor window, staring out at the horizon as the first light of dawn touched the fields. Evelyn joined him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've done this before," she said, "too many times. Do you ever think about them? Every day?" She looked at him, truly looked, and saw the weight he carried, the weariness in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of death. And in that moment she realized that her hatred for him had faded, replaced by a strange tenderness that terrified her more than anything. He turned to her slowly, their eyes locking in the soft morning light. "You should stay away from me, Mrs. Dalton," he said softly. "This road doesn't end kindly." But she didn't move. The air between them trembled with a kind of fragile understanding, a shared loneliness neither could name. And though neither spoke another word, both knew that something had changed, that the widow and the hangman had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Outside, the gallows waited, silent and patient, while the Mississippi flowed on, carrying with it the sins and secrets of every soul that had ever lived upon its shores. The days that followed passed like a fever dream, the kind where time blurred and reality lost its edges. Evelyn Dalton moved through her house as though under a spell, the presence of Thomas Hale altering the rhythm of every breath she took. He had settled into the study, spending long hours alone with his ledgers and instruments, yet she could feel him everywhere, the weight of his silence in the hallways, the warmth of his gaze lingering after he'd left a room. The plantation seemed quieter since his arrival, as though the land itself held its breath. The servants moved softly, whispering about the stranger with the haunted eyes. Even the horses grew restless when he passed the stables, their ears twitching, their hooves pawing nervously at the ground. But to Evelyn the tension he carried was magnetic, a pull she both feared and craved. Each time she caught sight of him, his broad shoulders in the doorway, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, she felt something unholy stir inside her, something that had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with being alive again. One evening, as twilight draped the world in violet, she found him in the barn mending the collapsed roof himself. His shirt sleeves were rolled high, revealing forearms marked with old scars. The sight of him working in silence, the muscles moving beneath his skin, made her throat go dry. She stood there longer than she intended before he noticed her. "You shouldn't be out here," he said without looking up. "The boards are slick." "I could say the same for you," she answered softly. "You're not a carpenter." He gave a small, humorless smile. "No, but I don't like things left broken." She stepped closer, drawn by something she didn't understand. The smell of rain and cedar filled the air. "Were you always a hangman?" she asked. He stopped hammering. The question hung between them like smoke. "No," he said finally. "Before the war in Mexico, I was a soldier. Then I came back to nothing. No land, no family, no name anyone cared to remember. This was the only work offered that paid in coin instead of pity." Evelyn lowered her gaze. "It must take a strong heart to live with what you've done." He turned to her then, his blue eyes shadowed by something deep and tired. "It doesn't take strength, Mrs. Dalton, just the ability to forget. But forgetting," he paused, "is its own kind of death." A shiver ran through her, and she wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't believe you're as cold as you pretend to be." He met her gaze for a long moment, then said quietly, "You shouldn't want to know me that well." But it was already too late. That night, long after she returned to her room, his words echoed in her mind until sleep became impossible. She rose before dawn, pacing the veranda, and saw him by the stables again, his figure cut against the pale horizon. He looked like a ghost from another life, a man who had lost his way but kept walking because stopping meant feeling the weight of his sins. The execution date loomed closer. Every day, the courthouse workers erected more of the gallows, and every night Evelyn felt her sanity slipping further from her grasp. She had written countless letters pleading for clemency, but no reply came. In the solitude of her room, she began to wonder whether Samuel had truly been innocent. There had been things, small, ugly things, she had ignored during their marriage, the whispered arguments behind locked doors, the secret meetings near the riverbank, the night he came home with blood on his shirt and said it was a hunting accident. Now those memories came back like ghosts demanding to be seen. On the fourth night, unable to bear the silence, she went to Thomas. The study door was half open, the fire burning low. He was seated by the desk, staring at the noose coiled neatly beside his tools. She hesitated before stepping inside. "Can you tell me," she asked softly, "how you do it, how you end a life?" He looked up sharply, then away. "It isn't something I take pride in, but you must know what it feels like," she pressed, her voice trembling. "To watch a man's last breath, to see what remains." His jaw tightened. "It feels like watching your own reflection die." Evelyn's throat closed. She wanted to hate him, wanted to throw the noose into the fire and scream that he was a monster. But instead she whispered, "I'm sorry." He rose from his chair, the faint light tracing the hard lines of his face. "Don't be. You didn't make me this way." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Dalton, Evelyn," he said quietly, and it was the first time he'd spoken her name. "Whatever you think of me, whatever you feel, don't let it blind you to the truth about your husband." She froze. "What truth?" "There are things in that file at the sheriff's office," he said slowly, "that don't match the testimony, the inspector's report, the money that vanished. It doesn't add up." Her pulse quickened. "You've seen it. I've seen enough to know your husband wasn't just a cotton merchant." That night, after he'd gone to bed, Evelyn stood at her window, watching the flicker of his candle through the crack beneath his door. She wanted to knock, to ask him what else he knew, but fear kept her rooted in place, fear of what she might learn, and of what she already felt. The next morning she rode into town under the guise of visiting the church, but instead she went straight to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk, Sheriff Carter, eyed her warily. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, "you shouldn't be here. Your husband's case is closed." "Then you won't mind if I read what's already been decided?" she replied, forcing a steadiness she didn't feel. After some hesitation, he handed her the thin case file. Inside were a few letters, an autopsy report, and a receipt marked with her husband's signature, payment for transport and cargo inspection, but the cargo wasn't listed. "Only a number, 47. Evelyn frowned. "What does this mean?" The sheriff sighed. 47 men, shackled, brought from Louisiana. The inspector your morning wasn't the first to question Mr. Dalton's trade." Her hands went cold. She turned the pages and found a statement written in the inspector's handwriting, dated the day before his death. It read, "I have reason to believe Samuel Dalton's shipments conceal unlawful human cargo." If found true, his punishment must be swift. Evelyn dropped the file. Her breath came shallow. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. When she returned to the plantation, Thomas was waiting on the veranda. He looked at her face and knew she had learned the truth. "You saw it?" he said quietly. She nodded. "He wasn't the man I thought he was." "I'm sorry." "No," she whispered. "Don't be. I think I've known for a long time." For the first time since her husband's arrest, she wept openly, not for Samuel, but for the years she had spent loving a man who had traded souls for gold. Thomas took a hesitant step toward her, then stopped himself. "You should rest," he said, though his voice trembled slightly, but she reached for him, her hand brushing against his arm. "Stay," she said. He froze, torn between duty and desire. For a long, unbearable moment, the only sound was the wind through the magnolia trees. Then, slowly, he took her hand. The touch was brief, but it felt like confession. That night they sat together by the fire, the silence between them no longer sharp, but fragile and intimate. Evelyn spoke of her childhood, of how she had come to the plantation as a girl, and married a man her father had chosen. Thomas listened without judgment. When she faltered, he reached out, his fingers brushing the tears from her cheek. "Evelyn," he said softly, "there are things I've done I can't undo, but if I could take this burden from you—" She stopped him with a whisper. "Then don't hang him." He closed his eyes, the pain in his face deeper than any wound. "If I refuse, they'll send another, and they'll hang me too." "Then let them," she said, her voice breaking. "You're not like them. You still feel—" He looked at her as though she had struck him. The candlelight flickered across their faces, casting shadows that made saints and sinners of them both. And then, before either could stop it, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was desperate, trembling, born not of passion, but of two broken souls clinging to what little life they had left. When they parted, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rumbled across the horizon, a storm gathering once more. The gallows stood ready, but inside the Dalton house another judgment was being written, one that would not be carried out by law, but by love, guilt, and the unrelenting pull of fate. Morning came gray and heavy, as if the sky itself regretted what it knew was coming. The rain had stopped in the night, leaving the world damp and shivering, and yet the air inside Dalton Manor was hotter than it had been in months. Evelyn woke before the first light, her heart pounding like she'd been running. The memory of the kiss still burned against her lips, haunting her with both shame and longing. She had not meant for it to happen, or perhaps she had. There was a part of her that no longer cared about what was right or wrong, only what felt alive. Downstairs, the house was silent. Thomas was gone from the study, though his hat still hung by the door. The noose that had rested on his desk the night before was missing. A chill ran through her as she imagined him carrying it in those careful, steady hands, the same hands that had trembled when they'd touched her. She told herself that the kiss meant nothing, that he was still the man sent to kill her husband, but her heart refused to obey. When she stepped outside, she found him by the stables, fitting the saddle to his horse. The morning light caught the edges of his face, softening the hard lines. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "I have to ride into town," he said. "They need the gallows inspected before the final day." She wanted to beg him not to go. Instead, she nodded. "I understand." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then mounted his horse. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "whatever happens after this week, remember that I never meant to hurt you." And then he was gone, the sound of hooves fading into the mist. Evelyn stood there for a long time, her nightgown brushing the damp earth, her heart aching with something she could neither name nor undo. Inside the house, she tried to busy herself with meaningless tasks, dusting the shelves, tending to the wilting flowers, setting the table, though she knew no one would eat. But her mind kept circling back to the sheriff's file, the cryptic line about 47 men, and the inspector's final note. There had been one page missing from the file, she was sure of it, a page torn cleanly, leaving only the faint imprint of ink against the next sheet. Someone had taken it. When Thomas returned near sundown, the sky burned red like a warning. His expression was grim. The sheriff received word from Jackson. He told her, "The date is fixed, 2 days from now." Evelyn's hands tightened on the back of a chair. "And there's nothing left to do." He shook his head slowly. "Not unless you believe in miracles." That night she could not bear to eat. The candles flickered across the dining room, their flames struggling against the humid air. Thomas ate little as well. They sat in silence, both pretending not to see what the other was thinking. When she rose to leave, his voice stopped her. "Evelyn," he said, his tone low, almost pleading, "don't come to the execution." She turned, startled. "You think I could watch my husband die? I think you'll try," he said, "and it will destroy you." The way he said it, soft, raw, honest, made her chest tighten. "You talk as if it won't destroy you too." He met her gaze for a moment too long. "It already has." The following morning dawned pale and hollow. Evelyn woke to the sound of footsteps outside her room. When she opened the door, she saw Thomas carrying a sealed envelope. He placed it on the entry table. "For the sheriff," he said, but when he turned away, something fell from his coat pocket, a folded scrap of paper, damp from the morning air. Evelyn picked it up after he'd gone. The handwriting was faint but familiar. "If he dies, so do they." It was signed not by Thomas, but by someone with the initials S.D., her husband. Her blood ran cold. The note was dated the day before his arrest. Evelyn's mind spun. If he dies, so do they. Who were they? The inspector, the slave Samuel had trafficked, or someone else entirely? The note reeked of threat, not confession. She realized then that perhaps her husband's death would not end his crimes, but unleash them. Determined to know the truth, she left the plantation that afternoon without telling Thomas. The road to town was thick with mud, the air heavy with the scent of pine and decay. When she reached the sheriff's office, Carter was nowhere to be found. She slipped inside anyway. The case file still lay on the desk, but this time she looked deeper behind the drawers, beneath the papers, and there she found it, a second note, torn along the edge, matching the imprint from the missing page. It read only a single line: "Payment received. Keep the man silent until departure." Signed again by S.D. Evelyn's stomach turned. Her husband had paid someone to keep the inspector quiet, to buy his silence. But the man had refused, and Samuel had silenced him in the only way left. As she stepped back into the street, a shadow fell across her. Thomas stood there, his eyes hard with worry. "I told you not to come here," he said. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew he killed that man." "I suspected," he replied, "but I couldn't tell you until you saw it yourself." Her voice broke. "Then why still hang him? Why not let him rot in prison?" "Because the law doesn't care for mercy," he said quietly. "And I can't stop what's been ordered." She stared at him, tears burning her eyes. "You could leave. You could run." "I've run enough in my life," he said, "and men like me don't get far." That night they did not speak. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled over the river like cannon fire. Evelyn lay awake, listening to the rain lash the windows. Downstairs she could hear Thomas pacing, his boots striking the wood in restless rhythm. She wanted to go to him, to tell him that none of it mattered, that she didn't care what he'd done, or what he would have to do. But she couldn't. The world would not forgive a widow who loved the man who hung her husband. At dawn she found him standing outside the barn, his clothes soaked, his expression hollow. "It's time," he said. The words struck her like a physical blow. She followed him without speaking, her body moving of its own accord. The town was already gathered by the courthouse, a sea of dark coats and murmurs. The gallows loomed against the pale sky, its rope swinging gently in the wind. Samuel Dalton stood at the base, thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt but defiant. When he saw her, his mouth curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "My darling wife," he said, his voice sharp as glass, "you finally came to watch." Evelyn's breath caught, Samuel, but before she could finish, he turned his gaze toward Thomas. "And this is the man they sent. Tell me, hangman, do you sleep well when you dream of widows?" Thomas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He moved with quiet precision, his face unreadable. Yet Evelyn saw the tremor in his hand when he reached for the rope. The sheriff read the sentence aloud. The crowd fell silent. Evelyn felt her knees weaken. Every sound seemed distant. The wind, the creak of wood, the low hum of dread. Then Samuel's voice rose again, calm but venomous. "You think you've won, Thomas Hale, but you've been their tool, same as me. Look under your own name. See who pays your wages." Thomas's hand froze. "What are you talking about?" Samuel smiled, cold and thin. "The Dalton accounts. You've been paid in blood since before you set foot here. You just never knew whose." The world seemed to tilt. Evelyn's heart hammered as she looked between them. Thomas's face had gone pale. The sheriff barked for silence, but the crowd murmured uneasily. Then Samuel's voice rose one last time. "They'll hang me, but you hangman, you've already hung yourself." And then the lever dropped. Evelyn screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Thomas turned away, his face ashen, his eyes fixed on nothing. When the crowd dispersed, he stood alone beneath the empty noose, rain beginning to fall again. That night, Evelyn found him in the barn, his shirt soaked with rain, his hands shaking. "He was lying," she said, trying to reach him. Thomas shook his head. "I checked the records. The payment came from a Dalton trust. My name's on it. I've been their executioner for years. Evelyn, paid through the same men your husband served." She stepped closer, tears in her eyes. "Then stop letting them own you." He looked at her with a broken kind of calm. "And what would that make me? A man," she whispered, "not their instrument." He stared at her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. "If I walk away, they'll come for both of us. Then let them come," she said, her voice steady. "We've already lived our deaths." Outside, the storm raged, the river swelling high with the sins of men long gone. Inside, in the dim light of the barn, the widow and the hangman stood together for the first time, not as enemies, but as survivors. And though the world beyond still demanded blood, for one fragile moment, they chose something else. The storm did not stop for 3 days. It rolled over the Mississippi in waves of gray fury, swelling the river until it consumed the banks and devoured the roads that led out of town. The Dalton plantation stood at the edge of it all, isolated by mud and flood, the great white house gleaming faintly through sheets of rain like the last remnant of a vanished world. Evelyn moved through its echoing halls as though she were trapped in a memory. Every corner held her husband's shadow, every window pane his reflection. But Samuel Dalton was gone, buried in an unmarked grave on the courthouse hill, and yet it felt as if his voice still whispered through the walls. Thomas Hale had not left since that morning. He worked in silence, mending fences, gathering supplies, saying little. The guilt that hung over him had settled deep, a quiet and unbearable weight. Evelyn tried to reach him, but he had built a wall around himself stronger than any she'd ever known. When she brought him food, he only nodded. When she tried to speak, his eyes drifted past her, as if he were already half gone. On the third night, she found him sitting by the fire in the parlor, the glow flickering across his face. Rain pattered softly on the roof. "You haven't slept," she said gently. "I can't," he replied. His voice was low, hoarse, as if scraped raw by everything he'd seen. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, and then I see yours." She sat across from him, the silence between them thick as smoke. "You did what they ordered you to do," she whispered. "You carried out a sentence. That doesn't make you guilty." He gave a bitter laugh. "Guilt isn't about what the law says. It's about what you carry when the law is done." The firelight danced in his eyes. Evelyn studied him, remembering how steady those hands had been on the rope, how soft they'd been when they'd touched her face. "Then let me carry it with you," she said. He shook his head slowly. "You've carried enough, Evelyn. Outside, the thunder rumbled low and distant. She stood and crossed the room to him. For a moment neither spoke. Then, quietly, she asked, "What did he mean that morning? About you being paid by the Daltons?" Thomas hesitated before answering. "I went through the records, it's true. Every execution I performed in the last 3 years was ordered under the Dalton accounts, hidden through state channels, disguised as wages. Your husband built his fortune on more than cotton. He owned half the men who enforce the law out here. I was one of them, and I didn't even know it. Evelyn's blood ran cold, so he owned death," she said softly. "Owned it," Thomas replied, "and rented it to men like me." The storm pressed against the windows. Evelyn turned away, her thoughts racing. Then everything, his trial, his sentence, it was all a performance. Perhaps, Thomas said, his voice distant, or perhaps the empire he built was too dangerous to let live. Either way, someone wanted him silenced. She looked back at him, a terrible understanding dawning. "And now that he's gone, they'll come for whoever knows the truth." His gaze met hers, full of something dark and resigned. "They already have." Before she could ask what he meant, there was a sound at the door, a hard knock, 3 times in quick succession. Thomas rose instantly, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver on the mantel. Evelyn's breath caught. The knock came again, louder this time. When Thomas opened the door, 2 men stood on the porch, rain pouring down their coats. They wore the uniforms of state deputies, but their eyes carried the same cold emptiness she had seen in the men who had dragged Samuel to the gallows. Thomas Hale. One said, "You're to come with us. Orders from Jackson. There's to be an inquiry into the Dalton execution." Thomas didn't move. "The sentence was lawful. That's not what's in question," the man said. "They want to know what happened afterward. Too many names in that ledger you turned in." Evelyn stepped forward. "He's not going anywhere." The man sneered. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." Thomas's voice cut through the storm. "It concerns her more than anyone." The deputies exchanged a look. "You've got an hour to get ready. You don't come quiet, we'll come back loud." They turned and disappeared into the rain. When they were gone, Thomas closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. "They'll kill me before I reach Jackson," he said. Evelyn's hands trembled. "Then don't go. If I stay, they'll burn this house to the ground. They'll call me a murderer and you my accomplice." She stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "Then we leave tonight." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, not as the widow of a dead man, but as the woman she'd become. "You don't even know where I'd take you." "I don't care," she said simply. "Anywhere but here." For a moment he said nothing, then he nodded. "There's an old ferry station 2 miles south near the bend. If we can reach the river by dawn, we can follow it down to Louisiana." They moved quickly. The storm had eased into a fine mist, though the ground was still slick and treacherous. Evelyn packed what she could, a few clothes, a locket, the inspector's letters, and the torn note with her husband's signature. Thomas saddled the horses, his movements efficient but tense. When they rode out, the wind carried the faint cry of crows overhead, echoing through the flooded fields. The road to the river was nearly gone, washed to clay. Twice they nearly fell, the horses stumbling against the mud. The world smelled of wet earth and decay. Every sound made Evelyn flinch, the crack of a branch, the distant roll of thunder, the whisper of unseen voices in the trees. She had lived her whole life on this land, but now it felt foreign, hostile, cursed. When they finally reached the ferry station, dawn was just beginning to break, a dim, colorless light over the water. The station was little more than a shack and a wooden dock half-sub, merged beneath the rising river. Thomas dismounted and helped her down. "We'll wait here until the current slows," he said. "Then we'll take the flatboat across." Evelyn nodded, though her eyes kept drifting toward the tree line. Something felt wrong, too still, too quiet, and then she heard it, the faint sound of horses. Thomas heard it too. His expression hardened. "They've found us." From the shadows, 3 riders emerged, the same deputies, their rifles gleaming. "End of the road, Hale," one called. "You can make this easy or hard." Thomas drew his gun but didn't raise it. "There's a woman here," he said. "She's done nothing. Neither have you." The man sneered, "But orders are orders." Evelyn's heart raced. She stepped in front of Thomas. "If you want him," she said, "you'll have to go through me." The deputy hesitated, his aim faltering. In that instant Thomas moved. One shot rang out, sharp, deafening. First man fell. The second fired back, the bullet grazing Thomas's shoulder. Evelyn screamed as the third rider charged forward, but Thomas swung around and fired again. The man collapsed into the mud, his rifle falling into the river with a splash. When the silence returned, it was deafening. Only the rain remained soft and relentless. Thomas sank to his knees, clutching his wound. Evelyn rushed to him. "You're bleeding," she whispered, pressing her hand to his shoulder. He managed a faint smile. "Not the first time, Thomas," she said, her voice breaking. "We have to go." He looked past her to the river, the water churning dark and fast. "We can't outrun it forever." She shook her head fiercely. "Then we don't run, we start over." He laughed softly, the sound fragile and hollow. "Where does a hangman start over?" "By choosing to live," she said. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the widow and the hangman, both born of sin and circumstance, both searching for something that had never truly existed. The river hissed and swelled, swallowing the dock inch by inch. Finally Thomas stood. He took her hand and guided her toward the flatboat. Together they pushed off into the current. The current caught them, spinning the boat toward the wide bend. The plantation faded behind them, the house shrinking until it was no more than a pale memory against the darkening sky. As they drifted south, Evelyn felt the first warmth of sunlight break through the clouds. Thomas sat across from her, pale and tired but alive. The blood on his shoulder had begun to dry. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, his eyes held something that almost looked like peace. "Evelyn," he said softly, "you should know. I never believed in salvation." She reached across the space between them, taking his hand. "Then believe in me." The river carried them onward, the water glinting with the faint shimmer of dawn. Behind them, the Dalton plantation sank into silence, its legacy of cruelty swallowed by the land it had once ruled. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and uncertain, neither promise nor punishment, just the open expanse of what might still be possible. And as the Mississippi rolled on beneath them, the widow and the hangman vanished into its endless current, bound not by law or sin, but by the fragile, defiant hope that even in a world built on death, love might still find a way to live.